Welcome to an episode of the podcast Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. The theme of the podcast is New York, with a focus on behind-the-scenes conversations with fascinating people who are making an impact in the world of art, design, and architecture. Paul Goldberger, labeled the leading figure in architecture criticism by the Huffington Post, began his career at the New York Times, where in 1984 he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his distinguished criticism in architecture, the true Purple Heart of journalistic accolades. In this interview, Paul tells us the story behind the 2015 biography, Building Art, the life and work of Frank Gehry, about one of the world's most iconic architects. Paul also talks about his most recent book, Ballpark, Baseball in American City. Paul Goldberger, Pulitzer Prize winning author. In every architectural documentary that I watch, I count the minutes until you show up. Because you always do. And
I'm not sure that's good or not, but thank you.
Okay. And you have this incredible ability to explain very complex issues in a very clear way. I remember in one documentary I watched, you characterized the genius of Jean Nouvel in 2 sentences, and I think that was quite an achievement.
Thank you.
So we're very happy to welcome you as our guest on this podcast, Art Insiders New York, to discuss Building Art, the life and work of Frank Gehry. And you have some new projects also.
Yes.
Ballpark, Baseball in American City, and I'm sure you have many other things cooking, and we can go into that later.
Sure.
I'd like to start in a different end, though, and that is, what does an architectural critic do?
An architecture critic is somebody whose job it is to help educate people about the built environment around us, make judgments about it. I also feel part of my job is to help build a constituency for good design, be an advocate of good design, a sort of public advocate for quality design. Maybe that's the best way to put it. I'm also an enthusiast. And for me, often there's a tension between my excitement about new things and my judgment, which frequently tells me that these things may not be quite as good as people claim. And so, but architecture is about the long term. It's not like a movie or a play that, where the critic's job is in part to be a sort of consumer guide. Should you go to it this weekend or not? Buildings are not going to get torn down if I don't like them.
I see.
But it's much more about taking a long-term view about what kind of city are we building? How does it all affect us? What impact does it have?
So in your work, do you have a frame of reference that you embark upon? Or do you belong to any ism? Do you have some, so that people, when they read your things, do they know where you're coming from?
No, that's a very fair question. I think years ago, earlier in my career, I had a lot of sympathy and interest in the postmodernism movement as it was developing. But now I think of myself really as somebody whose sensibility is much broader and more eclectic, and I'm much more interested in quality where it can be found and less interested in isms. I'm not by nature an ideologue or a dogmatist at all. I think that's been true most of my life. I did a book a few years ago called Why Architecture Matters, that tried to sort of come to terms with just how things affect us, how they have an emotional impact on us. And in the course of writing that, I talk about it in the book, I talked about sort of how my own eye sort of developed. And I did my undergraduate work at Yale, which is famous both for modern architecture, a lot of important buildings by Louis Kahn, Eero Saarinen, Paul Rudolph, and so forth, but also has these very beautiful Gothic buildings from early in the 20th century that for a long time were mocked by architects as just cheap stage sets and nothing more. It's fake architecture.
Yeah.
And so, I went there believing in modern architecture. I went there, in fact, in part because I was attracted by the excitement of those post-war buildings, post-World War II buildings.
Yeah.
This was in the 60s and 70s. I got there, I was in fact excited by them. I did like them. But then I discovered I loved all that old stuff too.
Yeah.
And coming to terms with just what made it have an emotional hold on you.
Yeah.
Even though it was, quote, sort of fake in a way, or it was, if you want to put it in terms analogous to post-war art, the modern buildings were more like a form of abstraction, and these were more like figurative painting.
Yeah.
But, it's possible if you love art to like the best of both. Mm-hmm. And it's even possible, even if you believe very much in abstraction, to believe that there are contemporary figurative artists who are doing valid work.
Yeah.
Similarly, I found myself comfortable with both. And so an awful lot of my life has been an attempt to sort of try to navigate between ideologies and yet make it very clear one is not therefore saying anything goes, anything's okay, because of course you need to have a critical eye.
I see.
And there's a real difference between Gothic architecture done well by James Gamble Rogers at Yale in 1917, and garbage churned out by somebody else in some other circumstance, just as there's a real difference between great modern buildings by Louis Kahn and garbage on Third Avenue or what have you. So it's the more deeply I got into it, the less I felt ideology mattered. And the more it was a matter of what experience did this actually give you when you stood before it.
So when you look back at your long career and everything that you've published, can you see a pattern here that you have gone from A, B, C, and to D, or have you been traveling with this big suitcase with everything in it all the way? If you can understand that.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful metaphor. I love that. And yes, I do think I've been traveling with a suitcase with a lot of stuff in it, because I said a few minutes ago that I've always been an enthusiast, and I do feel that while I hope as a good and serious critic, my enthusiasm will never go to the point where I lose critical judgment. Yeah. Nevertheless, it's a sort of fundamental part of my sensibility, and I find it hard to write off really good things that come from a different, just because they don't fit into one particular pigeonhole.
Yeah.
I think that's one reason I'm a good critic, but would not have been a very good architect. Because I think an architect or an artist, to be truly great, has to feel that there's only one real way to do this.
Yeah,
and it's his way.
Yeah.
But a critic, in fact, should not feel that way. Because then, in fact, then you don't really... Then the critic, in a certain way, can't be trusted because there's just a simple litmus test. Does it match that style or does it not?
Yeah.
But in fact, there's too much good stuff in too much of a range. The one absolute for me as a critic that I feel, to the extent that there are absolutes at all, is I think the ism that I would call urbanism.
Yeah.
The values of the city. Of building a city, of making buildings fit together to make a place in which the whole is something larger than the parts, the value of the street, the fact that we tend today to believe, and I very much believe this, that the building is not an isolated sculptural object, but something that has to fit in and enrich a larger whole.
Yeah.
But even with that said, there are exceptions there too. I mean, the Guggenheim Museum breaks that rule totally.
Yeah.
And yet we would be a much poorer culture and as well as a much poorer city if that did not exist.
Yeah.
And so we need to break the rules every so often to understand them and to have them.
I understand. Interesting. So let's talk about this book that you wrote, Building Art, the Life and Work of Frank Gehry. Now, this is a biography, and if I understand things right, your first biography.
It is the first time I've written a biography.
So what is the difference between your the writing that you used to do and a biography? What?
There's a huge difference. I mean, the only thing they really have in common is that this is still obviously about architecture, which my other writing is too. But it's the story of a life rather than the story of work. I mean, that's the fundamental organizing principle. I mean, there's a certain amount of critical commentary about Gary's buildings woven into it.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, it is a biography. And it was very important to me to have the experience of trying to get inside someone's mind and look at architecture and creative work from the standpoint of the creative person himself and try to figure out how his mind worked. I also find him a fascinating, not only a very great architect, but a fascinating person in many ways. And I wanted to stretch myself in a different direction, even though I wasn't ready to leave architecture in terms of the writing I do.
I see. So your vision behind the book was to tell the story about his life and to understand why those incredible buildings came out as a result of it.
That's right.
Is that fair to say?
That is absolutely fair to say and absolutely correct. I mean, to the extent that we can ever truly understand creativity.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, we cannot. But we can come close, and we can certainly understand and create in writing the conditions that surrounded creativity and from which it came, and ponder how these things connect. In the end, nobody, including Frank Gehry's therapist, can truly know, precisely what little synapses in the brain fired in a certain way and what made that happen, any more than you can, truly understand Mozart or Beethoven, or or Franz Klein, or William de Kooning, or Rembrandt, or what have you. But that doesn't mean that probing their lives is not a worthwhile cause, and that there are not lots of connections between the life and the work.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think you mentioned that in the book sometimes, the relationship between the psyche and the art, that what he is producing. And this book is a wonderful, entertaining read, actually, filled with lots of fun stories. And I love the fact that. Was it Richard Serra who said that architecture, his architecture is not art because it's got a toilet in it, and they call him a plumber. I like that.
Yes. Well, they had a very once close and now contentious relationship.
Of course.
And I think Serra is one of the great artists of our time, if not of any time. And in fact, I just saw his exhibition at the New MoMA and at Gagosian, and they're just, I think, mind-blowingly powerful and brilliant.
Wow.
But I respond to them in part because, of course, Serra is very architectural in his sensibility. And he makes you feel the power of space and the power of form more successfully than many architects do. I think the problem between Serra and Gehry is that they each flew a little too close to the other. and Gehry makes architecture that has a very potent and rich artistic component to it. Serra makes art that has a very powerful architectural component to it. They were no longer distant enough in separate turfs to be comfortable. And I think it exploded into a sad misunderstanding, actually, from two of the great artists of our time. Maybe at the end of the day, they were too competitive to really be friends, or for the friendship not to fall apart.
I see. Maybe you could become the peacemaker there.
I've actually tried a little bit, and I did see Serra at one point a few months ago, and I was very pleased that he brought up this book about Gary, which he'd read, and said he thought that I dealt very fairly and honestly with their relationship and with the issues. Maybe in a way that was actually not so favorable to Gary, because I don't think Gary said that to me. But that's good, because it means I had, enough critical distance from my subject here, who I like and admire, as I've said, but not uncritically, and obviously there needs to be some criticism.
Now, this podcast is for people who are not necessarily experts, but who wants to learn, to get a richer experience from art, design, and architecture and stuff like that. So, how would you explain why Frank Gehry is so interesting for you to write a book about him, and for the general public? What does he symbolizes that makes him a person that we should focus on?
Well, Gehry is, of all architects working today, I think the one who has come the closest to forging a point of intersection between the highest ambitions of architecture, which is to make art, make art that we live in and work in and use, and popularity. It's very rare that serious things become genuinely and widely popular, especially in architecture. There are not many examples of that. There are not really in much of any field. I mean, the most serious music is rarely at the top of the pop charts. The most serious novel is unlikely to be number one on the bestseller list, so forth. But when Gehry did the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, you had what almost every critic in the world felt was the most important building at the end of the 20th century, in 1997, when it opened. And yet, it also was wildly popular, and crowds swarmed into Bilbao, all kinds of people that are not necessarily architecture or even art buffs. Felt compelled to see it and go. And that continues to be the case many, many years later. So the first thing that interests me is that intersection, because for me, the connections between the highest aspirations of art and popular taste have always been interesting ones. In part because it's so rare that they do connect. But Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, in many ways, was the equivalent of a building like, say, Saarinen's TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport, which we were talking about earlier, and which has just been restored as part of a new hotel, which is incredibly popular, and always was, actually.
And why do you think that is the case with the TWA building, if we could do a little a little detour here? What do you think? Is it so that people they see a building and they think, why couldn't all buildings look like this? Why couldn't all buildings have this?
I think at TWA, people love the sense of drama, of sculptural drama. The fact that the building feels like a work of sculpture. It's a beautiful, exciting, and unusual form. It does seem, in a certain metaphorical way, to relate to the idea of flight. And certainly soaring space makes you think about flight and so forth. People have always liked buildings that were spatially dramatic and powerful. That doesn't mean they want all buildings to look like that. In fact, indeed, you don't want all buildings to be like that. You don't want to live in a building like that necessarily, any more than you want to listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony all the time. It would quickly become banal. It would quickly become, in fact, you'd start hating it, which would be the worst thing of all if you did. So, we need, because architecture's around us all the time, we need to balance off moments of moderation with moments of emotional intensity. But the TWA building was a great moment of emotional intensity, as indeed Frank Gehry's work often is as well. The other reason we don't want everything to be like that is it would be a horrible city. I mean, imagine a street with 5 TWA terminals lined up. It would be cacophony. It would be ridiculous. Any more than a sentence that's full of exclamation points.
So back to our friend Frank Gehry here. So is it possible then to describe? You said that it's in the intersection of something that is a beautiful work of art and the popularity. And we should mention that the Bilbao. It's a fun story in the book when you talk about Philip Johnson with tears in his eyes, said that he thought that Bilbao was the greatest building of our time.
Yes, Philip Johnson saw it in the last decade of his life and really felt Gehry was the best architect and this was the best building. That's exactly right.
What was their relationship?
It was a fascinating and very close relationship based on, they were very, very different and their architecture was very different. While Johnson had great admiration for Gehry's architecture, Gehry had bemusement veering occasionally on contempt for Johnson's architecture. But he had huge admiration for Johnson's intellect and taste and judgment. And Johnson was one of the great one of the great appreciators of both art and architecture of our time, probably as powerful a force for the popularization of architecture in the culture as modern times have had, and as impassioned a student of it. He and Gehry would get together and they would just talk. They would just talk for hours and hours about the work of X and Y and Z and about historical figures and about contemporary figures and about who they admired and who they didn't and why, and they would argue sometimes too. But Gehry found in Johnson an intellectual companion, and they became extremely close. He just chose to not engage particularly with the issue of Johnson's own architecture, which was, let's say, mixed at best. But in fact, it's a testament, I think, to the nature of their relationship and also to Johnson's own sensibility that while he would have preferred to be appreciated as an architect, he sort of understood that the basis of his relationship with Gehry was something else. And his own sensibility he was not a great architect. He had the most interesting architectural mind, maybe, of our time, and was one of the greatest connoisseurs of our time. But his own architecture was a mix of this and that taken from other people, because he was not a potent creative force in the way that Gehry himself is. And I think in his heart of hearts, Johnson knew that. It was painful for him to admit, but he did understand it. And so I don't think he pushed Gehry too hard on that particular issue. And they had a very close friendship that continued until Johnson died at a little bit before his 99th birthday in 2005.
Wow. I think talking about Bilbao, you mentioned in the book a fascinating comparison between Frank Lloyd Wright, Guggenheim's museum from 1959 to Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in 1999. And to pay homage and go beyond and define a single system of geometry, or for that matter, by any conventional order. What is the line between the two of them in your mind?
It's not a direct, simple line. Certainly, I mean, Wright's geometry is simpler. Gehry was, in a way, playing on it, but also breaking it apart and making it a whole set of disparate, different kinds of spaces. It's an exploded version of Wright's Guggenheim in some ways. But Gehry did something very clever in his Guggenheim, which is that within this very complicated, multifaceted structure that, among other things, is actually better integrated into the cityscape of Bilbao than Wright's is into the cityscape of New York. But inside it, there are actually a fair number of rather conventional galleries, rectangular, almost traditional sort of galleries, so that there are better places in which to hang paintings than there are in Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, which is spectacular architecturally, but famously problematic as an exhibition space.
It's interesting you mentioned in the book that Frank Gehry has been criticized for doing very expensive buildings, but Bilbao was actually relatively a cheap building.
Yes.
He says somewhere that he designs a dumb box just to get the what needs to be stored, and then he puts architecture around.
Architecture around it. That is sometimes what he does. He's very sensitive on that idea of cost and almost defensive about it, and believes in fact that he is not always an expensive architect and does not want to be known as that at all.
It's also another interesting thing in your book that talk about the architecture and the art, and to what extent a museum should have such grand architecture, because it takes away from the art itself. And
well, does it or does it not? That's the question.
Yeah. And where do you stand in that?
Okay. I think it's a somewhat false dichotomy.
Yeah.
I think it can sometimes take away from it.
Yeah.
I think, for example, Daniel Liebeskin's addition to the Denver Art Museum in Denver, which is full of sharp angles, is a wonderful place for sculpture, but an almost impossible place to hang pictures. Because there's so few vertical walls.
Yeah.
And it's a space that's kind of about itself in a certain way. Gehry says that he feels that in architecture that is not purely neutral, that artists often kind of rise to the occasion, respond to it, and engage with the building, and a whole new level of dialogue, you could say, arises, which is in the relationship of art to architecture.
Yeah.
I think he also believes, as do I, that it's a fallacy to believe that there's any such thing as true neutrality in architecture.
Yeah.
I mean, every environment you're in, even a white box, makes a certain aesthetic statement.
Yeah.
And a pure white box is saying something as well, and may be very good for certain kinds of post-war abstraction, let's say.
Yeah.
It also may be terrible for other kinds of art. And so there's always some relationship between the container and the thing contained. It's never truly neutral. And the question is, can it be a positive relationship? With something like Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, I think it's as wrong to say it's bad for art as to say it's brilliant for art. In fact, it's problematic, but it's wonderful for certain kinds of art. But it puts great limits on what you can do well there and what you can't.
Yeah.
I remember many years ago a retrospective of Kenneth Noland, as well as one of Calder.
Yeah.
In fact, the Calder was the greatest of all because there was a big Calder hanging in the center of the atrium, spectacular.
Yeah.
And then you could stand on one side of that rotunda and look across, and you see 3 or 4 floors of paintings all together.
Yeah.
Which is a very powerful vista aesthetically. Yeah. Same with the Noland. I mean, when you have sort of large, strong, colorful abstraction that communicates well at a distance, the Guggenheim can give you an aesthetic experience more powerful than any other museum for that reason. On the other hand, it doesn't come free. You pay a price, and the price is that when you're actually walking to see the art, you have to see it in the exact sequence because there's no other way to do it. You can't vary the sequence as you might please as you might do in another kind of museum.
Yeah.
And also there are some kinds of works that really do not work so well in it at all and don't give you that extra bonus of how beautiful it looks across the way.
Yeah.
And but for certain things, it's incredibly good.
Yeah.
So, and if you look at Gehry and Bilbao, is the same thing.
Yeah, I saw Hilma af Klint at Guggenheim, and I thought those big paintings on the ground level there was just fantastic.
Yes.
And you can see them from that upside podium looking down at it.
Exactly. So that you can have certain experiences you would not have elsewhere that are great, but the trade-off is other things don't work very well at all.
Yeah. And Frank Gehry, he was much into art, not only architecture, if there is a distinction there. I mean, he was very much into ceramics.
He actually briefly started as a ceramicist.
Yeah.
in college, and then moved into architecture.
Yeah, and he did some jewelry for Tiffany's, the fish lamps, the furniture. So he was, and he loved to hang out with artists.
In his early years, when he was in his 30s, beginning of his career in Los Angeles, he really was part of the early LA art community in the 1960s, much more than the architecture community. They were his buddies, and he really was part of that world of Los Angeles artists who came from a time when Los Angeles was considered irrelevant to the art scene, which is not the case now, of course, but it was then.
Yeah. So another famous building is, of course, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, 2003,
yes,
correct?
Yes.
And I think that there is some very poetic language there. I tried to quote it here. I'm not sure I got it right, but the steel sails seem to fly and make the enormous building light and full of movement, visual and emotional pleasure, an ode to the joy of architecture. What are your feelings about that building?
I love that building. I think that's actually possibly the greatest public building in America of the last generation, and certainly our greatest concert hall of modern times. It's the cathedral of downtown Los Angeles, more than the actual cathedral of downtown Los Angeles, which is a rather nice building by Rafael Moneo, the Spanish architect, but not as poetic and as spiritual as Walt Disney Concert Hall is. It's a building that, the relationship of architecture to music is one that is both simultaneously profound and trite and a little bit cliched, but you really do feel it in this building.
Yeah.
That in fact, the lyricism and the rhythm of music is expressed in architectural form in a very beautiful way. It's also just a physically very comfortable place in which to listen to music. You feel an intimate connection to the orchestra when you're in the auditorium. You feel the pleasure of beautiful public space as you approach it and enter it and so forth.
Yeah. No, it's incredible. I was there in June and I looked at it. It's just fantastic. But he started doing breakfast nooks. I'd like to have one of those. So do they do they still exist?
I don't think so. No. He was not actually designing them. He was delivering them and installing them. This was when he was 18 years old and had just moved. His family had moved from Toronto to Los Angeles, and he got a job with a cousin's trucking firm or something, and he was delivering these pre-installed breakfast nooks.
Oh, I see.
They had very little connection to his architectural career. The most important connection was to his life, because one of the clients was a family in North Hollywood that had a rather attractive young daughter who became his first wife.
Oh, yeah.
So he met his first wife through his early job as a delivery guy and installer of these things.
I find the book very interesting because you seem to look at his life from very many different angles, and one thing, of course, that I found very interesting was how you described his personality as a combination of Frank Lloyd Wright and Woody Allen.
Thank you. Yes, I think that was one of the better lines in the book, I think, actually. I'll give myself that. But it's true, because he has a combination of great ego, and yet he's very self-effacing.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of aw shucks quality to him.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit disingenuous, but nevertheless engaging and appealing.
Yeah.
Yet he also has, he is not a truly modest person, but he is, at the end of the day, a kind and warm person, which does not always go with artistic genius either, actually.
Yeah.
And
but he was uncomfortable with this star architect or this genius. They say they geniused me to death or whatever.
Yes, he is. He's uncomfortable with it, but there's that's also a little bit disingenuous, because he's uncomfortable with it, but I think he would miss it if it went away at the same time. So he very much wants to be known for more than just great, one-of-a-kind, one-off buildings like Bilbao and Walt Disney Concert Hall and so forth. He has been working very hard in the last few years to do both more smaller pro bono work and to broaden the range of what his firm does. You know, he's serving as the overall architect for the city of Los Angeles for the future of the Los Angeles River and trying to turn a lot of it into public space, which is a project that began just after the book was finished, so it's not in the book at all, or the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where he is completely redoing the interior, redoing most of the gallery spaces, and expanding it underground. But there will be almost no visible sign if you drive by the museum in a car of Frank Gehry's presence. You have to go in to see it. And he's actually very excited about that project because he views it as an attempt to show that he is not just somebody who makes unusual shapes that you either like or don't like. But that he can also solve a lot of internal problems as an architect.
He seemed to be very good at building relationships. I mean, it comes through in your book that he wasn't very comfortable in the corporate setting, working for a board. He wanted to feel the person who gave him the assignment and wanted to get along with that person.
That is absolutely right. And he has developed very close relationships with a lot of his clients. The other side of that is when he doesn't feel comfortable with a client, he's often not that eager to do the work. And
he walks away.
And he has walked away from many things over the course of his life. Sometimes to the detriment of both his own career and other people and some clients. Yes. So he was a pioneer in technology, actually. The digital technology is what made the construction of Bilbao, of the Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain, possible. The engineers would still be trying to figure out some of those curves and how to do them if it were done with slide rules and things like that. So it could not have been built without digital technology. And that's been true of now so much architecture, but Gehry used software that had been initially developed for the aerospace industry. And he was the first to bring it into the world of architecture.
So, Paul, you're now working on new projects and you just published a new book, Ballpark, Baseball in the American City, correct?
Yes, indeed.
Tell me a little bit about how did that idea come up?
It's a big change from Frank Gehry, Ballpark, that's true. I've actually always loved baseball and particularly baseball parks and written about them in short things over the years, but never anything major. And some years ago when the new Yankee Stadium and Citi Field opened in New York, at that point I was the architecture critic at the New Yorker. They asked me to write a column about these two new stadiums, ballparks. And I did. And in researching it, I realized that there was just such a rich and interesting history of the relationship of baseball to the history of the American city. That they'd influenced each other, and that the history of ballparks effectively parallels the whole and mirrors the whole history of American urbanism. You know, the early ballparks were deeply integrated into neighborhoods and shaped by them and very much part of them. Then, in the mid-20th century, baseball kind of moved to the suburbs, these big concrete donuts surrounded by parking lots. And then, beginning with Camden Yards in Baltimore in 1992, they attempted to come back and reintegrate into the city with varying degrees of success, but nevertheless did so. And that exactly parallels the culture's view of cities. In other words, we believed in our cities and invested in them and lived in them, and then post-World War II, we began to abandon them and move to the suburbs, and then beginning in the last 25, 30 years, we've been trying to re-engage in some way and rejuvenate our cities. And so that you could almost tell the history of American cities through baseball. And they are interesting and unusual buildings, many of them. And the baseball park is actually a valid form of American public space. And so, a lot had been written about baseball over the years, but not much about baseball parks except some, big, nice coffee table books with lots of pictures, or a couple of little guidebooks for people who want to go visit all the stadiums and so forth, what to do. But nobody had ever actually done it as real architectural history. And so I decided I would take that on, and I had an incredibly good time writing it, of course, because for the first time I could go to baseball parks anywhere and and see everything, and I had a wonderful, wonderful time with it. And it's been wonderful to see it well received, and to try to sort of make a point of intersection between the world of architecture and the world of baseball. I think it's the only American sport where the history is rich enough and deep enough and interesting enough to justify a book like that. I mean, people said to me, well, you're going to do football stadiums next or something like that. Whatever you think of football as a game, football stadiums are not as interesting as architecture as baseball parks are. And they don't have that long, rich history of beginning in the 19th century as almost sandlots, and then gradually getting more and more elaborate, and then becoming what they are now. Football is a much more recent sport. Football stadiums are much bigger, and kind of, they are what they are. But, whatever.
So are there examples of ballparks that they're coming back to it and sort of renovating it?
There are two great surviving ballparks from the golden age of the early 20th century that have in recent years been renovated pretty well and preserved. One is, of course, Fenway Park in Boston, and the other is Wrigley Field in Chicago, which is actually on the cover of the book. And they're special and wonderful and extraordinary places. In New York, sadly, our ballpark that was of that same generation and at least of equal quality, if not better than those, was Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, which was destroyed in the early 60s. And that whole story is told in the book of the Dodgers' decision to move and how it happened, and their attempts to build a new ballpark in downtown Brooklyn, which were fascinating, and ultimately wrong-headed, because what they had in mind was a huge domed stadium that would have been like the Astrodome in Texas. Probably would have been a disaster in downtown Brooklyn. So it didn't happen. They finally gave up and went to Los Angeles, and where they embarked on another long and painful saga of, because it took years to get their stadium built in Chavez Ravine, Dodger Stadium, because of, and here actually this connects in a funny way to Frank Gehry, a very distant way, but nevertheless real. Where the Dodgers built their stadium, which is now, believe it or not, the third oldest ballpark in use in the major leagues, is on a site that had a famous and large and very happy and successful Latino community. The city of Los Angeles evicted half the people in the early 50s to build an enormous public housing project, which never went ahead. And Frank Gehry was in that point in architecture school in the early 50s. And he was among the protesters who tried to dissuade the city from building it. And it didn't happen. The land lay fallow for years, and then when the Dodgers came to Los Angeles, the city decided that would be the best site, offered it to the team, and then they proceeded to clear the rest of the residents who had remained, and there was a lawsuit about that went all the way to the Supreme Court. But to go back to contemporary ballparks, we've seen some very good ones in the last 15, 20 years that have built on the success of the Baltimore one. But I think the very best is PNC Park in Pittsburgh, but also what's now called Oracle Park in San Francisco. Wonderful. Minneapolis, Target Field is really good. I love Coors in Denver as well. There's and Petco Park in San Diego. All really, really good places.
It's great. But what are you working on? What's in the pipeline for you now? Now you published that book, so.
Well, I have a book I'm working on now, actually, yet a different variation on architecture, a different kind of approach. It's the story of Dumbo, not the elephant, the neighborhood in Brooklyn, actually, and how it came to be. It has a very interesting history, goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, but a particularly interesting contemporary history because it was this amazing neighborhood with these beautiful industrial buildings that was all but abandoned right on the waterfront. And a far-sighted New York developer named David Wallentis bought essentially all of it, or most of it, at the end of the 1970s when most people thought nothing in New York was worth anything.
Wow.
And held on to it and struggled to hold on to it and turned it into the neighborhood it is now, which is booming beyond all reason, in fact.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm on my way out there after we finish talking because we have a meeting with the photo researcher to discuss pictures for this book about this neighborhood. So that's one project I'm working on, and I have some ideas for others as well. But
I see. That's interesting.
That's the next one.
It's fascinating. I was out there a couple of weeks ago, and it's a big West Elm, big furniture house in that old building that is really, really nice.
That's the Empire Stores, the beautiful old building that the state took over. It's the exterior of that, by the way, there's a very famous Berenice Abbott photograph of it.
Yeah.
The state took it over in the late 70s to save it, but then didn't know quite what to do with it, nominally made a park around it, but it was not well cared for. And it was fought over for years. More recently, it's all been completely restored and it's quite beautiful now. But,
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to come here. I have just one more question for you as an architectural critic, and that is Hudson Yards. What is the...
Well, I'm going to answer it by going back to baseball again. And ballpark. And actually, in my book, Ballpark, I express regret that the Mets did not build Citi Field on the site of Hudson Yards, which I think would have been a wonderful place to have a ballpark in New York.
Yeah, right by the water.
Well, by the water and also closer to Midtown.
Yeah.
So that people, one of the most wonderful things we see in cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, which has an excellent new ballpark and so forth, is that, at 6 or 7 p.m. on a nice summer evening, people impulsively will make a last minute decision, let's leave, they finish work, and let's walk over to the ballpark and go to a game. We can't do that in New York. It's too far away.
Yeah.
And even though we have 2 new ballparks that are good, or at least decent, we don't have that option. And it would have also been a nice way to have inoculated Hudson Yards against a criticism that it has gotten, which is that it feels like a kind of gated enclave for the rich. Because ballparks are inherently much more democratic and they bring in so many people.
Yeah.
And a baseball park, unlike a football stadium, which, as you know, was considered for that site as part of the New York Olympics bid way back in the early 2000s, a baseball park fits into a city better. A football stadium really doesn't. It's too big and it's not used enough. So, it's bad for a city to have something that's used only 8 times a year. But a baseball park is used 80 times a year at a minimum and often more.
That's a good point.
And it's smaller. So those 2 things mean it fits in. There would have been ample room on the rest of the site to still put up a bunch of condos and office towers and still have a baseball park as the centerpiece.
Yeah.
So that's my greatest regret. What we have there now, I would not be honest if I did not say it was a disappointment in many ways. We're never, in our lifetimes, if ever, going to be doing something as large and ambitious in New York again. And it's not just that the architecture is disappointing, it's that the layout is fundamentally suburban, it feels to me. You don't feel the energy of the city streets coursing through it. You feel as if you've stepped away from the city into some suburban office park that just has buildings that are very tall as opposed to 3 or 4 stories tall as they would be in a suburban office park. But the mood of it is still that.
Yeah.
And I find that, a great disappointment. I don't believe that this is the greatest single evil ever foisted on New York, the way some people do. But, it is certainly a disappointment given what we're capable of.
Yeah. Yeah, to some extent it reminds me of Battery Park City, even though I really like the to walk and run along the river, Hudson River there. Mm-hmm. But when you're in the area, it feels like you can be somewhere else. You're somewhere else. You're not in New York anymore.
That's right. Battery Park City was designed with a very conscious attempt to keep the feeling of New York. Mm-hmm. I mean, that waterfront promenade. Yeah. The nature of even the little architectural details, the idea of all the little streets, it extended the grid of streets across it. Whereas Hudson Yards is much more of a super block. Mm-hmm. And that's a notion in urban planning that I thought we'd kind of gotten past. Yeah. And indeed, in the redo of the World Trade Center after 9/11, they've made an effort to restore streets, put them back. It's not all, but some of them that were taken away from the World Trade Center and get back to somewhat smaller blocks. They have not done that at Hudson Yards, which disappoints me.
Yeah. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Anders. It's so great to see you.
And good luck with Dumbo and your visit out there.
Thank you.
It's a promising, a very interesting project. And thank you for sharing your thoughts about building art, the life and work of Frank Gehry, and ballpark baseball in the American city. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. Thank you for listening, and be sure to visit www.artinsidersnewyork.com to join the conversation and subscribe to the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode of the Art Insiders New York podcast, head over to iTunes if you're not already there to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It is very much appreciated. Thank you. This episode was produced by UOM LLC, copyright 2019.